So, welcome back from lunch. Welcome to this seminar with the title EU and the Prosperity Gap. My name is Ylva Pettersson. I am a program manager at the Swedish Institute of International Affairs. So last panel discussed world trade and developments that we can see, and this panel will take a closer look at one of these relationships, the one between EU and China. China is now EU's second biggest trading partner behind the US, and the EU is China's biggest trading partner. China and EU trade on average 1 billion euros per day. And as you all know, China is the most populous country in the world, and since 2016, it's the world's second largest economy in nominal GDP, and the world's largest economy in purchasing power parity. With the economic development in China, which has also lifted millions of people out of poverty, how has the situation changed the situation and the rights for the Chinese workers? The aim of this panel is to explore whether increasing living standards of Chinese workers, enabled in part by a developing social security system, has had any impact on the trade relations between EU and China. Economic arguments for that will be that with this social reform in place, the Chinese workers will be increasingly willing to reduce their savings and increase spending and consumption. So to help us with that, we have an excellent panel. First of all, I would like to welcome Professor Chen Ding to the stage. So Chen Ding is a professor in economics, Jean Monnet Chair, Director of Center for European Studies and Dutch Studies Center at the Fudan University. You're also acting editor of World Economy Outlook and chief editor of the annual report on European economic development. You're specialized in the fields of world economy, European economic and social integration, European welfare state, European and Chinese social security systems. So Professor Chen Ding will give us a presentation, and then we will follow up with some panel discussion. The floor is yours, please.
Yeah, thank you very much. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends. I'm very happy to be invited here to this very idyllic and nice city, which I first time visit. So the task for me for this afternoon is actually the development of Chinese social security system and its impact to the EU-China economic tie. So I will actually divide this presentation into three parts. The first part is a very brief introduction about social security system. But as in China, especially since the 1978, actually the launch of reform and opening up policy was launched. And then I will switch to a very brief description about EU-China investment and trade, with focused trade, and then the relationship between these two. So first of all, I want to give a very brief introduction about this process of establishment of Chinese social security system. So actually, as you know, after the establishment of New China, that was in 1949, till the end of 1978, actually that's the Chinese economic system is actually adapt the Soviet model, that's central planning economy. And with this, we have also the related very short coverage social security system. And then from the beginning of our economic reform, we have going to this transition period, which actually the social security system also adopt these kind of changes and make some experiments. And then from almost 2003 or 2004, the target for us for the social security system is to rebuild and reconstruction a so-called unified nationwide social security system with universal coverage. So that's the framework of our traditional social security system. Actually, that's for the period of central planning economy. At that time, almost over 80% of our total population are living in the countryside. For those almost 80% of population, they do not have a kind of social security. The social security is only focused on the urban area for urban employees, exactly. So that's two schemes. The governmental insurance scheme for those employees, urban employees working for non-profit institutions like schools, universities, or government department. And then the another scheme is so-called labor insurance scheme, which is for those urban employees working for SOEs and also collective enterprises. So that's provide a very limited coverage rate, less than 20% of the total population. And since the middle 1960s, we have the so-called Lulu Cooperative Medical Scheme, which based on the so-called barefoot doctors. Yeah, as some people here may know this, because at that time that was very significant. And then, like I mentioned, when people starting our economic reform, the things have changed. At first, under the framework of economic regime, and then it's also have impact to the social security fields. Yeah, so that leads to a so-called problem like decline of coverage rate, the funding problems, the obstacles for free mobility of labor force, and also unfair competition of enterprises, different ownership, and also we are facing with the aging problems, because the aging people was increased, especially when people in China implemented these so-called one-child policy since the beginning of 1980s. So that's actually changed the demographic structures, which led Chinese society I mean, the percentage of senior person above 60s near 10%, which actually into the so-called aging society. And then with the rapid increase or rapid economic growth, no doubt we have also always increased demand for the welfare system or for the well-performance social security system. So that's some key steps with this process, which I mean that with the adoption of the transition period from central planning economy to market-oriented economy. So gradually, people has reformed the traditional, very shorted coverage rate social security system, and nowadays the framework by us in China now is like this. The core of the social security system is social insurance. Actually, we have these 5 main social insurance schemes. That's pension insurance, medical insurance, maternity insurance, unemployment insurance, as well as work-related insurance. Till now, we still do not have a social insurance for actually long-term care, but the experiment in this field is just ongoing. And then the second priority of the Chinese society, Chinese social security system is social relief. Yeah, I think here the minimum living standard system for both urban citizens and rural citizens is very important. And then the social welfare, yeah, that's more focused on the senior person, for children, for disabled person. And for urban area, we have also this so-called housing security. So that means for employer and employee, they pay the social contribution and organize these kind of housing funds. When people purchase housing, they can use this. For those who cannot afford to purchase a flat or a house, they can use the so-called affordable housing allowance, or these low rent housing, which actually built by the government. They can rent with a relatively cheaper rent. And then we have also this special care and placement, which is focusing more on the mobilized soldiers, and also the veteran, and also the members of the militaries. And then maybe you know that there is a very big gap between the urban area and the rural area. So we call this more as a dual society. So different from the social security system we built for the urban area. Actually, we have a very simple social security system scheme for rural area, which made up of rural pension insurance, new rural cooperative medical insurance, as well as a rural minimum living standard system. So maybe I say something about the funding or financing system of a new social security system. Actually, differ from the previous one. I mean, the traditional social security system was based on pay-as-you-go system. It's more a horizontal balanced system, but for the new system, the funding mechanism is a mixture form based on pay-as-you-go and pay-as-you-earn system. So employer and employee should pay social contribution, and the most social contribution paid by employer will flow to a social pooling fund. Actually, that's based on the cities at first, and then upgrade more to a provincial level. And in the end, we want to have a so-called nationwide unified social pooling fund for all the people from the country. And then we have this individual saving account system. Actually, we learned this from the case of Singapore. So that means while you are working, you should also pay social contribution and accumulate it in your individual saving account with the years. So by the benefits of this, the pension system is here just described two parts. Now, one part is 20% of average monthly wage, which the city or the provincial has pooled. And the second part is more the division of accumulation. So at first, when the retirement age by us in China is 60 years old for male and 50 or 55 for female, and life expectancy at that time is 70 years old, so it's almost 10 years, which means 120 months. So that's the beginning when people launched this in 1990s. And then with the increase of life expectancy, so nowadays it's more extend to 139 months. And that's the funding mechanism of our urban medical insurance, which launched in 1998. It's almost the same. It's a mixture of pay-as-you-go and as well as pay-as-you-earn system. Only by the benefits side, we have three stages. The first stage is so-called deductible, which accounts for 10% of annual average salary or income of the city or the province has pooled. That means with this reimbursement, people could solve the problem of medical expense which occurred from the outpatient practice. And then it's into the second stage, which is co-insurance or co-pay. That means individual themselves together with this social pooling fund will pay for this kind of medical expense. Yeah, the ratio depends on the age. The younger, the more you yourself have to pay for this. And then we have the ceiling or the cap, just involved to collapse the whole social pooling fund. Yeah, the ceiling at that time when people launched this in 1998 is 4 times, but nowadays it's increased to 6 times of annual average insurance, average income. So that's a glance or overview of these totally 5 social insurance scheme by us. Here we have the premium or the social contribution, which actually partly paid by your employer, partly by employee, and also the beneficiary or the eligibility for the benefits of these 5 social insurance schemes. But that's more for the urban citizens, I mean urban employees as well as urban citizens. That means urban, you have urban ID plus job, that's urban employee, that's kind of type. And the second type is urban residence. Yeah, that means you have urban ID, in order to separate these to the people with Lulu ID. And then I give an image about coverage rate nowadays in China. The status quo of these coverage rates for these 5 social insurance schemes is like this. For pension insurance, both for urban as well as Lulu residents, that's almost 85%. For medical insurance, actually that's 3 levels. Like I mentioned, level 1 is for urban employee, level 2 urban citizens, level 3 is for farmers or for people with Lulu IDs. That's more than 90%. But with unemployment insurance, work-related injury insurance, as well as maternity insurance, the coverage rate is relatively lower. It's just the half of the population. So here, actually, that's the process or development of the insured population of these 5 social schemes. Yeah, so here you can observe that a very steadily increase in terms of pension, in terms of medical insurance. And then this graph just shows the situation of social relief. Actually, the person who received this minimum living standard allowance or the other social relief allowance since 2007. Yeah, so that's actually during these 10 years. Yeah, you can see that I think that the most population received this minimum living standard allowance is from Lulu area, and the total consumption was declined with time. And never forget that actually, during these almost 4 decades of Chinese opening up and reform policy, according to my view, that's the most important achievement we have had is this poverty alleviation. Yeah, so you can see that from the very beginning of opening up, it's almost 1/3 of the population are under the poverty line. So at that time, it accounts for 250 million people are under the poverty line. Be careful, at that time, the criterion for definite poverty line is far lower than nowadays. And then till now, it's dropped to 3.1%. Totally, it's about 30 million people still in mainland China. Be careful that we have adjusted the criterion of poverty line. That means we increase this quite rapidly. It's almost approaching the international standard. That means the daily consumption are above 1.2 US dollar. And then switch to the investment or the input of the whole society in the social security system. Although I think compared to the welfare system here, especially in the European countries, it's relatively lower because as far as I know, the social expenditure ratio here in Europe is more than 20% normally. In some countries, far exceed this. But in China, although it's growth with a very rapid growth rate, but still, in the year 2015, it's only reached 11.5%, which means the total social expenditure vis-à-vis GDP. Here we may also have to mention that the government spending in the fields of social security expenditure was increased with time, especially since the year 2004. So nowadays it's almost 40% of total social expenditure. And when people are talking about the social expenditure, it's mainly based on two parts. The first part is more based on the social fund, which actually contribute by the employer as well as employees. And the second part is more the fiscal or financial input of government. So here, just I show the income and expenditure of a social pooling fund, which is actually also increased with the year. Here, which I want to show is actually the input of fiscal input of government, different level into the social security. It's about 12.2% of total fiscal expenditure. I think compared to the ratio here in European countries, it's relatively low, but in China, it's quite big efforts. So that also leads to the increase of disposable income for the urban area and also for the rural area. In China, we have statistically separated this into two parts. So per capita disposable income of the urban residents in China from 1978 to 2017 was increased very rapidly. You can see here the graph. And then the per capita disposable income of rural residents was also increased, especially in this administration of President Xi Jinping. And then this graph, I want to show you that compared to the increase of GDP growth rate, the social expenditure and the fiscal input in the social security was grow faster than growth rates of GDP itself. And then that's no doubt leads to the result that the rapid development of household or private consumption in China. So here you can see this kind of rapid increase here that actually have quite positive means for the import, also include the import from the European side. So here I actually says quite something about the performance of the social security system by us in China. And then still we have quite a lot of problems and challenges, especially when people are talking about the reconstruction or perfectization of our social security system. The main purpose in general, as far as I observed at first, is the limited coverage. Like I've mentioned that till now, we still do not have the universal nationwide coverage rate for all kinds of people, especially for those people, I mean, migrant workers, which account for 250 million migrant workers, which means they have a rural ID, but they move to the urban area. So they do not belong to the social security, which covered for urban citizens. They should belong to a social security scheme, which for rural area, but they moved to the urban area. So that's actually a very big challenge for Chinese social security system. And also people talking about the inequality, because if you have a look of the benefits or even the social contribution rate, you will observe that there is a big gap among different types of citizens. Yeah, like I mentioned, people classified people as urban employee, urban residents, farmers, or migrant workers. So that's quite different. That's still not that fair for all the citizens from mainland China. And I have also to mention that we have very fragmented social security system. Even with the first level of social security, which is focused on the urban employee, it's still not nationwide unified. For example, I'm from Shanghai. So if I change to move to Beijing, I will have a problem, because till now, the social pooling fund is still based on the provincial level. That means the social contribution rate, even the beneficial level, different provinces are different. Yeah, so that's kind of this fragmentation. And we have also problem with financing. Yeah, so for quite a lot of provinces, they still have a deficit when people talking about his social pooling fund, which means that the income was less than its expenditure, because you base on this charge of social contributions. And also under the circus customs of the challenge of economic globalization, we have also the problem for the social contribution rate, or for the burden of employers. Because nowadays, when we calculate the social contribution rate burden for our employers, it's account almost for 30%. It's not included the social contribution rate they should pay for their employees for housing security. So that's a heavy burden, which actually a challenge or a pressure for themselves, especially for the international competition. And for the challenges, no doubt, the rapid aging process. Yeah, till now, we have almost 11% of total population are the group over 65, and you know that we have already this kind of a problem, and this is why in China we have actually do not carry out the so-called one-child policy nowadays, because people already realize that's very dramatically changed the demographic structure and could be a challenge for pension system as well as medical care and long-term care system. And the far speed of urbanization and industrialization also leads to the problems or challenges for the reconstruction of our social security system. Yeah, because like I've mentioned, for those migrant workers, which between urban area and rural area, yeah, so you should also prepare the scheme for them. And also the forms of employment has also changed and also diversified, which also built up the new challenge for the social security system. And no doubt the cost containment is a challenge. So that was a brief introduction about our social security system nowadays, and also its process and the funding system, benefit system, and challenges. And then I'll switch to actually the EU-China trade and investment. As the chair has already mentioned, that China is the EU's second largest trade partner. EU is China's largest trade partner. And when people are talking about FDI, EU outwards FDI to China keep on a very steady level. In turn, EU-China inwards investment from China grows more quickly in recent years. So here you can see Sino-EU trade of goods account for 15% of EU total external trade, and 20% of EU's total import, and 9.5% of EU's total export with China. So when people are talking about the structure of the import and export products, both sides are in line with so-called intra-industry trade characteristic. So especially here you can see highlighted in red, the most biggest item here, trading goods, is machinery and transport equipment. That's also the progress of upgrading of Chinese manufacturing, I think. So here I want to just show the top 5 goods importers from China are the Netherlands, Germany, United Kingdom, Italy, and France. And then Germany, UK, France, Italy, and Netherlands are the top 5 goods exporters to China in turn. And when people are talking about the balance of trading goods, when we have the figure of 2017, only Germany, Finland, and Ireland has a surplus. The other European countries from EU have deficit with China trading goods. And when we're talking about trade in service, in this sense, EU and China are the 3rd largest service provider to each other. And actually, in these fields, EU member states have relatively surplus together with China. That means compared to trading goods, which China has a surplus, that's quite opposite. That's also demonstrates, I think, the gap or the differences between Chinese economy and European economy. So here I take the biggest item of trade in service as example, the travel. If you have a look at the figure of travel items, that's quite clear that more Chinese tourists are here in Europe. So European countries really have comparative advantage in the fields of trading service. And when people are talking about outwards FDI from China to EU, which is grows very steadily. So from this graph you can see, which is in red, that grows very steadily. And then when people are talking about sector distribution of Chinese direct investment to EU, that's changed gradually from these real estate, hospitality, more to so-called high-tech or strategic assets. When people are talking about the geographical distribution of Chinese direct investment to EU, that's more dominant by the big 3, that's Germany, France, and the UK, which accounts for almost 2/3 of total. And then followed nowadays by southern European countries like Greece or even CE countries, I mean, especially Visegrad countries under the framework of One Belt and One Road initiative. And then the last part is actually the relationship between these two. So how is the performance or the development of Chinese social security system influence the EU-China trade and EU-China investment? So I think the working mechanism or the logic is like this. If people import more in the social security, if the social security expenditure by us in China increase more rapidly, which will also have the consequence that the saving rate of China will reduce because people have less actually preventive motivation to have more saving, and which could give more space to the consumption, which also means that more imported demand will increase. So here just I have some economic empirical studies. I just ignore this. I think that the logic of this is quite clear. Like I've mentioned, if you have import more social expenditure, it will actually decline or release the demand from saving, from preventive motivation, and which will release more demand for consumption, which will lead to more imports. So that's actually based on the model, and we have this regression, and the variables are like saving rate, and also the per capita social insurance expenditure. So we just want to confirm the relationship between these two. And we also want to confirm the relationship between the import from EU and the consumption. So yeah, the result is quite significant. And the explanation of this regression result is also quite clear, that the key explanatory variable per capita social security expenditure has a negative impact on the savings. And the key explanatory variable consumption of China has a positive impact on the import from EU, which means it's quite in accordance with theoretical expectations. And finally, very directly, we have the relationship between Chinese import from EU to the social expenditure. The result is also clear that China's social security fund expenditure has a very significant positive impact on Chinese imports from EU. So as a conclusion, I will have 4 points. Number one is the social security systems reforms has achieved a lot, both in terms of coverage rate and the scope of protection. The achievements of social security reform stimulate consumption, potentially in China, so which means the negative impact on saving rates. And the third point is consumption of China has a positive impact on the imports from EU. And finally, social security reforms in China and its progress is helpful for the prosperity for European countries. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Chen. I want to start by asking you, do you see that there's a general opinion with the Chinese people that they approve of the social security system? Do they think it's a good thing, or is it expensive, or what is the general opinion?
Yeah, I think it's quite clear that in China, people are seeking for a better performance of our social security system. So that's also why I here classified the third period, which is since 2004, as the period that we not only want to reform our traditional social security system, but also to reconstruct it more with a perfect performance or perfect function of social securities, like the welfare system here now in Europe, I think.
Thank you. So I would like to ask our two commentators up on stage, and I will introduce them as they come up. Kristina Sandkleff, she's an analyst and consultant, started her China studies in 1990s and has been working with China on different assignments since 98. She's been macroeconomist at East Capital, market analyst at Ericsson and Sony Ericsson, and political security analyst at the Swedish Armed Forces. She's a founder and today runs Kina-Polen and Sandkleff Asia Insights. And Lars Magnusson, professor in economic history, prefect of the Department of Economic History, Uppsala University, and Dean of Faculty of the Social Sciences, Chairman of the Swedish Collegium for Advanced Studies, and member of the Royal Academy of Sciences, amongst other things. Lars's research interests include regulation and political economy in historical perspective, and the Swedish model of labor market relations. welcome up on stage, both of you. First of all, do any of you want to comment on the presentation? Or anything that Professor Chanding said?
No.
No?
No.
Okay, Lars, then I will start by asking you. Could you explain to us the European experiences from the relationship between prosperity gap and economic growth and development?
Or should I?
You can stay.
Okay.
Lars, do you want to start?
Should I start?
Yes, please.
Okay.
Well, it's thank you very much for your presentation. It was very, you relieved a lot of things, and it was very, very helpful, I think, for us to form an opinion about what is going on in China at the moment. Perhaps we should, what I wanted to say is a bit of, perhaps beside, well, it is something it connects very much to Europe, but it's also more of sort of discussing the European experience and what we might learn from that, and what perhaps also China can learn from a sort of in a way like Europe, an earlier starter in this race for more welfare and you know, for high growth and so on and so forth. But perhaps I should start to make an advertisement from a book that came out this year, actually, and it was edited by Lars Oxelheim. It's an economist from here, Ulf Bernitz, Moa Mortensson, and Thomas Persson. It's called "Bridging the Prosperity Gap in the EU: The Social Challenge Ahead." And some of the things that I say now it's in this book. But it also could be, I mean, this is also a statement, this book, that we brought this out. And I discussed in this volume, I discussed specifically about the so-called social dialogue in Europe. But what it signifies most, and what's in this book, is that the whole idea of bridging the prosperity gap about welfare is still very much on the European debate. We know that during the last 10, 15, 20 years, there has been some kind of deteriorating rates of welfare. I mean, the gap, the prosperity gap, has increased especially since 2008 and the big financial crisis, or the breakdown, actually, not just the financial crisis, it was really a breakdown, especially after that, but also perhaps 10, 15 years before that. It started in the 1990s to increase this gap of prosperity in Europe. But it's still said that in Europe, in the EU, and in the different national states, we still, in a way, carry on this idea of that prosperity is very good, and that to narrow the prosperity gap is also a very good thing. I'll come back to that very, very, very soon. So this, in a way, this is what it's really this book about. Saying, in a way, that we come back to discuss more again the problems of social increasing income gaps and prosperity gap. The experience that we have, and I mean, of course, I will only have 5 minutes, so this will be extremely brief, this kind of historical sketching. But to say that what we in Europe had the experience of was, of course, since the starting with after the Second World War, 1945, especially during the 1950s and the 60s and the 70s. We saw this kind of bridging the kind of prosperity gap that you could be seen in the national states, and also between the national states in Europe and within the European Union. And then this kind of bridging this prosperity gap was all about. It could be related back to some kind of historical compromise between labor and capital, between sort of trying to fit mass democracy that became the result of the Second World War, and sort of the in a way the common people's commitment to this model, to this kind of form of mass democracy. So this came together in this kind of, in a way, historical what has been called a historical compromise. What we saw under the 50s to the 80s was, as I said, a decreasing prosperity gap, and that went together with very high GDP growth. I mean, that was the special European experience, of course. It was less perhaps in the 1980s, but I think that can be explained very much to other factors outside Europe as well. It has to do with the sort of the breakdown of the so-called Bretton Woods model, the Bretton Woods system. The monetary system of the world broke down in the 70s, and that led to a lot of problems that we also had in Europe. But especially in the 50s and 60s and 70s, there were lots of, I mean, you could see this kind of relationship between bridging the prosperity gap and very high economic growth at the same time. You could also see during this period, and I'm now making the story very short, of course, you could see in also that the beneficial effects of bridging the gap in terms of, I would say, and I think most researchers now will agree on that, on sort of rapid structural change of our economies, a rapid increase of productivity, and that we could see as an effect of bridging the prosperity gap. I mean, welfare had increasing welfare, perhaps through high labor costs and through social expenditure. I mean, you talked about social expenditure going up. I mean, that had the positive result that it led to structural change. And it led to a lot of, on this level, and as I said, increased very high productivity increase during the same time. And one could discuss, I suppose, the whole day why, I mean, these kind of relationships here, but it has to do with perhaps human labor and skills and skill developments and learning and things like that. Okay, then you could see, as I said, after these 1980s, if that's the sort of a turning point, you could see from the 90s and up to now, I would say, increasing prosperity gap in the EU, in Europe, and in the nations. Many of them, not all, but in many of the national states, not least Sweden. It's one of the worst cases in that sense of increasing the prosperity gap is Sweden, actually. It's a bit sort of paradoxical, perhaps. People don't know about that, but that it is. And at the same time that we saw this prosperity gap increasing, you could also see, paradoxically enough, in a way, given your model, it was less growth than before. It was less productivity increase. It seems to be more of a, I mean, where the European economies went into some kind of stalemate position at some point, very high, very low growth, GDP growth, and at least much lower than before, and low productivity increase. You also could find that demand to the increase that we know that one of the most important factors behind GDP growth is increasing demand. It was not only Keynes that said that. It is very clear in economics that demand increase is a very, very forceful factor behind economic growth, increase of GDP. And what you saw in the 90s and then the beginning of the 21st century was less demand than before. And to the extent the demand was carried up, was still there, it was very much depending on private lending. So what you could see during this period, especially after 2000, the beginning of the 21st century, is that the private lending going up very much so. And I mean, there are many who would say that some of the most important factor behind the financial instability after 2008, and indeed also the crisis of 2008, had to do with this increasing, especially private lending, not so much public lending, but rather this kind of private people borrowing up a lot of money in order to buy houses, especially, and other items, and that has, in a way, held up demand. But it has led, the price has been, of course, then perhaps a less stable financial situation in our countries. We could discuss that, of course. It is also possible, I think, to say that this kind of increasing in prosperity gap from the 1990s and onwards has also led to, is one of the most important conditions and reasons behind the political turbulence of what we have seen, especially during the last 10 years, not at least in the EU. And I'm talking, of course, about, it's hard not to see the relation between this situation of increasing prosperity gap and, for example, the Brexit. Or, for example, the discussions, well, this kind of rise of Eurosceptical parties and even countries that you have seen over the last 10 years. It has to do with a lack of legitimacy, and of course, increasing prosperity gaps is a very important driving force here. So just to make it short, what we perhaps could learn, and what also China and everybody could learn, that at least from our historical experience in Europe, we can see a clear connection between decreasing prosperity gap and very beneficial economic development. And we could see, perhaps, if we want to draw that conclusion, the opposite for the last 20 years or so, where you can see increasing prosperity gap has led to more economic problems than before. It also led to political consequences, a lot of political turmoil. So I'm completely running out of time now, so I should stop there, I think. But this could be added many more aspects, of course.
Okay,
but let's stop there.
Thank you. We can come back to those questions later. I want to follow up on what you talked about now and what you write about in this book that you mentioned, about the social dialogue that has been taking place in Europe. Are we adapting to the changing economy? Is the social dialogue adapting and following the trends, or is that why the social dialogue is not really producing any results right now? What would you say?
Well, to be honest, I would say I've studied this social dialogue over many years, and you could see the rise of social dialogue was very clear in the 1990s, especially. It was very strong, and the social dialogue means, of course, that both labor and capital, both the employers and the workers, in a way, the employees, are taking part in discussions about how to improve, for example, the labor market, the social security system, to make it more employment friendly. That's I mean, for example. I mean, so this is what the social dialogue has been about very much. So it was very, people were very enthusiastic about it. And then there went some kind of standstill in the beginning of the 21st century, let's say between 2002, 2006 or 2007. And one could, and I won't go into this because it's also a very long history.
You can read the book if you're interested, right?
Politics, but I think you could see. But then of course, after that, and after a number of years now, very, very boring kind of situation where this financial crisis has to be met and paid for, and some countries have fared extremely bad, like Greece or other countries in the southern Europe especially, but Greece especially. I mean, there's now a new turn, a new discussion coming up again about especially in this discussion about the EU 2020, that these issues about bridging the prosperity gap comes back. Well, of course, behind that is the historical experience we have, that this was very good for us. And it led to a lot of structural changes, to a lot of, and to high growth, and also to political and social coherence, and so on and so forth. So of course, in that sense, I mean, the issue is coming back a little.
Can I provoke you and ask you, because Chending has showed us the recent development and success of the development of social security system in China. Could the Europeans learn from this successful dialogue, or this successful development, and could we in some way learn how to advance from the Chinese example?
Well, yes. Well, in a sense, what we should not do, I think, my Chinese colleague and I mean, there has been sort of a strong model in economics saying that welfare is not good because it leads to higher costs. And higher cost leads to to less investment, less savings, less investments, and so on and so forth. This has been sort of one of the strong models, of course. But what I'm arguing here is that both China and Europe can learn from I think from history in that sense. That I mean, this is not really accurate, to be honest. Rather, it is the periods that we have seen the bridging of the prosperity gaps. We saw very high growth instead of the opposite. So I think what we can learn, both of us, is this model is not working. I mean, of course there can be there are a relationship between increasing costs and higher sort of effects on investment and saving, but that's not always. I mean, that does not always come to the bad. I mean, this is sometimes it's more of a positive relationship.
Yeah, I totally agree. Yeah, actually, as far as I know that the economists normally seeking for more efficiency of productivity, but I think when people always seeking for this, then the result is that the old framework were collapsed. So that's the problem, especially when people read the book which written by Piketty, The 21st Capitalism. That's quite clear that under the framework of or challenge of economic globalization, that the return of the investors or the return of the capital owner was grow so faster than the increase of labors. Yeah, I mean the salaries. So a phenomena which I observed that when people talking about the period of the economic globalization, which characteristic by the free mobility of capital in the last 20 or 30 years, that's quite clear. Which I means before 2008. Before the crisis. That's quite clear. The absolute poverty, the total amount of the people under the absolute poverty was reduced. But if we have a look of the Gini coefficient, it's increased. So that means that the capital owner, they have more return than the growth of labor force. So that leads to the problem that the society were polarized. Yeah, so that's also could lead to the problem of collapse of the whole society. So that's also why people could not seeking always for the so-called high efficiency of economic productivity based on competition or based on the market mechanism. So I think this is also the at least the common sense among most of Chinese economists. Yeah, so that's also why people take care of this increasing of labor costs, which also have the negative impact that more and more jobs was moved from Chinese side to our neighbors, to Vietnam, to Burma. Yeah, that's so quite clear. People obviously feel this kind of pressure. But also people observe that if we do not bridging this kind of gap, then the society will polarize, and then we will have a social problem. Then the system will be collapsed. So that's just compare the costs when the whole society collapsed. You have to rebuild this, and people suffer from this. And to compare this with the costs of, the competition of this kind of. So in this sense, I totally agree with your opinion. Yeah.
So this is a good bridge because I asked Christina to give us a view of the developing Chinese market, and you wanted to start off by giving us a background of living standards and social inequalities. Okay. So please, Christina.
Right. Thank you. Really, thank you very much for your presentations. So I was told to talk about bridging what this means if we manage to bridge the prosperity gap in China, we get more welfare. What does this mean for EU? And first, as Professor Chen has already said, China has been very successful in fighting poverty. So nowadays, according to the Chinese measurements, there are only 30 million people who are poor in China, which is fantastic. So where are the poor people in China? Well, they're mainly in the countryside. They're living in inland provinces. This is also one of the reasons why you have the new Silk Road projects. The Belt and Road Initiative is to embrace, incorporate the poorer areas so that they will be more wealthy. Often they are in remote mountain areas and could often be ethnic minorities. Living up in the mountains, there is no road nearby because what I've read is that if you build a road, that's the best way of decreasing poverty because then people go into the city and work and then they make more money. But what has happened during the economic reforms is that the income gap has increased. So when the economic reform started, everybody was basically equally poor. But now you have some people who are super rich and other people are still remaining poor, but they're not as poor as they were back in the days. Just an illustration of how poor people in China were. I read an account of a Chinese dissident, Wei Jingchang, why he became a dissident. And he was probably in your age, young person. He was in the Cultural Revolution, and you could basically travel around all over China during that period of time. And he was traveling around, train rides were free. And at one time, they stopped in some godforsaken city. And he saw this girl. She was dressed in this really weird clothes. And then he looked at her, what's she wearing? And he realized that she was actually naked. She was dressed in dirt. That's how poor China was in the 60s. And I think this is something that, at least to me, I got really shocked when I read the story, because you can imagine you're so poor, you don't even have clothes. You are actually dressed in dirt. But nowadays, it's not really like that. I don't think there are any people like that in China anymore. But you have, in last year, there were actually more US dollar billionaires in China. I don't know if you knew about this. There are actually more US dollar billionaires in China than there are in the US. And many of them are also actually involved in the political process because they're part of the National People's Congress and also the CPPC, which is the Chinese People's Political Consultative Conference. And here you have like the big CEOs of the really big, super interesting internet companies like Baidu, which is the Chinese version of Google, and Tencent, which you could say is like Chinese Facebook, but it's so much more. And Xiaomi, which is the, well, it's basically an iPhone type of smartphone, and so on. So these people are actually taking an active part in the political process. So how did China eradicate poverty? Well, they started the economic reforms in 1978. They opened up to the world, put some special economic zone very close to Hong Kong, which was very good because you had just started with the container traffic, and Hong Kong had an excellent harbor for shipping out things. Plus, they had the legal system, and they also had the financial system to support the trade. Also, it could be interesting to, we talked earlier about the rust belts in the US. China also has a rust belt, which is up in the northeastern part. And actually, that was called the cradle of planned economy before. And the reason why they went for this province in south was because it was so poor, so it was not really important to anyone. But the people up in the northeast, where you had all the planned economy, the big state-owned enterprises and steel mills, that was saved. And what happened was basically they were not opened up to the globalization. And so now they are called the Rust Belt. And people are leaving from there. They're hoping, I guess, that North Korea will open up and that will give a new boost to the economy, but still. They also had good neighbors. They could learn from Taiwan and South Korea and Japan. And these countries also invested in China, which made China climb a little bit on the production scale. They also allowed private entrepreneurs and allowed a household responsibility system in the agriculture. Before you lived on collective rural farms. They did not work out. They didn't work in the Soviet Union either. But when you were allowed to, you made basically a deal with the government that, okay, this year you are supposed to produce this much rice. Then you can cultivate whatever you want on the other side. Maybe you cultivate a garlic that's more profitable. And this allowed individuals to get richer. And I would say that many of the billionaires you have in China today, they are individuals who went for it. Jack Ma, who's maybe someone, I don't know if you know him, but he's the CEO of Alibaba, the e-commerce huge company. He started out as a young kid who wanted to learn English, so he would hang around this basically one and only hotel in Hangzhou, which is south of Shanghai, where there would be foreigners, and he would hang out and take them on tours and try to learn English. And he's actually so good in English that he can actually go on World Economic Forum and talk to Obama or whomever in perfect English. So he's a very interesting person. In January, I had the pleasure of being invited by the Chinese Embassy and Sweden-China Trade Council. There was like this PR tour from the Communist Party, because you had the big party congress in October. And so they had a vice premier, Li Xiaoqin. She was this quite short lady from Hunan, which was quite a poor province back in this. And I'm pretty sure she's like a former poor peasant, and now she's a vice minister at the United Work Front. The United Work Front is like the Communist Party's propaganda department facing abroad. So she was telling us all about the party congress, what came out of that. And then there were questions, and there was someone who asked, how do you fight poverty in China? Could you give us some advice? And she said that today the party sees that there is one thing that is important when it comes to fighting poverty, and that is that the initiative to not be poor comes from the person itself. It's the individual's responsibility to get out of poverty. I think that was really interesting. And then because, I mean, that really puts a lot of responsibility on the individual, that you actually, okay, you're poor, but you need to raise yourself in the hair and get out and try to get money, make money. And then she said that we encourage people to start their own companies. So maybe you start up a noodle stand and you sell noodles, and maybe you only make 1 RMB, which is like 130 Swedish krona per portion that you sell, but at least you're making money. And then little by little, you can become richer. Or if that doesn't work, the government can help you to find a job with a minimum wage, maybe in a factory or construction work or whatever. And this, I think, is really important, especially if you consider that in Sweden and also in other European countries, the welfare system is so good that it's actually not profitable for the person who's on the welfare system sometimes, in some conditions, to actually go back to work. It could actually be not profitable to start working. You could actually lose money. But this is not the way it's done in China. Then Professor Chun already talked about high savings. So the average Chinese saved 46% of his or her income in 2017. And the reason why it's so important to save, of course, is because the social security system, because you have to have money for that rainy day, healthcare expenses, unemployment, retirement, pension, education for your child. But also, another reason why you should save money, especially if you have a son, it's really, really important to buy him a flat, because otherwise, and also make sure he has a car, if he lives in the urban areas, because otherwise he will never get married. So sometimes the families, they actually pool together to buy a flat, and you really have to have a flat. If you don't have a flat, you're like, no girl will look at you at all. It is expensive. It's really expensive. But what can you not do to make sure that your family lives on, right? And then I think this is something we could discuss later on. The question is, like, will the Chinese automatically stop saving if the social welfare gets better? Maybe, maybe not. Something that I think is really important also to understand in this process is that with the urbanization is so speedy in China, in 2030 there will be estimated 1 billion Chinese living in urban areas. That will be like 70% of the population. In 2025 there will be 221 cities with more than 1 million inhabitants. I don't know how many million cities inhabitant cities we have in EU, but I don't think there are that many. There will be 15 super cities with a population of over 25 million people. And according to McKinsey, they have looked at different, you can see here, let's see, I don't know. Anyway, the blue at the top, at the bottom of this diagram is the poor people, but you can see that they actually believe that you will have 76% of the urban population will be upper middle class or mass middle class by 2022. That will be 550 million people. That's more people than lives in the EU, right? And so, okay, so we will have a large middle class. What will this mean? Well, they will mean that they will have need more social welfare, of course, but they will also do more consumption because they're living in the urban areas, so they can't cultivate their food themselves. And they will also get higher income because China is moving really rapidly on the technology ladder at the moment. But there will also be more home-biased consumption. People will like to buy Chinese because they're more nationalistic. And this is kind of interesting because you could look at, I don't know if you noticed during the World Cup this summer that there were 4 Chinese companies that actually had ads on the World Cup. One was Wanda. Have you ever heard about Wanda? Anybody knows about what Wanda is? They actually own the SF cinemas here in Sweden, and they also own the rights to show the games on TV. So they were one of the main sponsors. There were other 2 sponsors, Vivo and Hisense, which are electronic companies. Vivo is a really successful smartphone company, big in Pakistan and in India, but they haven't come here yet. Maybe they don't even dare to come here. They don't even bother to come here. It's such a small market here. And then there was another company called Mengniu, which is actually owned partly by Arla, which is a milk company dairy company from Mongolia. And they didn't even bother to have their ad in like not Chinese, so they only had in Chinese characters. And nota bene that China was not even a team competing in the World Cup. That says something about the Chinese consumers, I think. And then another assumption we often make with the large middle class is that when the economy grows, China will become a market economy, and then they will have democracy. That's why we let them into the World Trade Organization. So what about the drivers of consumption? Well, we have the upper middle class. Then you have younger people. They are more consumption-oriented because they never lived in poverty, so they have no problem spending money. E-commerce is really big. Gunnar Hökmark, I think, said that there are 800 million people surfing on the internet in China today. There are 410 million e-commerce users today. And they believe that in 2020, 74% of the online sales will be mobile e-commerce. It's expected to drive 40% of the increased consumption until 2020. This is so big. It's really hard to understand how big it is, actually. People are buying premium goods, healthy food, and so on. Things that you can actually not buy in ecological food. You can't really buy that in stores. I have a Swedish friend in Shanghai. They buy food, they buy vegetables from this American guy who has imported soil from the US, I guess, planted it out in Yunnan province, because he lives in Shanghai, by the way, and then it's watered with filtered water, because land soil is so bad in China. This is the only way for them, and they only eat imported beef and meat. Education is another thing, and travel. We'll come back to tourism very soon. Services will also increase, including tourism. And then you have the sharing economy expanding. So China has a Uber kind of company called Didi, which actually bought Uber in China because they actually failed the Chinese market. Now they had a bad weekend, I think, because there was someone who was actually being killed by her Uber drivers, and now they're Didi drivers, so they have a little bit of a problem. These bikes, Ofo bikes, you can actually rent a bike for, I think, is it 1 yuan or something? You drive and you pay really little.
Even less than 1.
It's even less, yeah. And then you just leave it wherever. They are actually having a GPS sender on it, so the people who own them can actually pick them up anywhere. But this means also that people won't have to buy bikes or cars. They can just share it. So the sharing economy is expanding. And then the question is, what do we have to offer from Europe and Sweden? Well, the fashion and trend influence comes from South Korea. This is a Korean pop band. They're called EXO, but there are 2 versions of EXO. There is EXO-M, which is the Mandarin version, and then there is EXO-K, which is a Korean version. So all these guys are Chinese, but they sing in Korean, no problem. They even sing in English, some of them. So this is a way to market, and you see, well, it's not really Swedish fashion, right? Booming e-commerce, you had Singles Day. Do you know what Singles Day is? Anyone has heard about that? It's the 11th of November. There's 2 double ones. So this is when you, as a single, have to pamper yourself. So last year, they spent $25 billion. This, to be compared with Black Friday and Cyber Monday combined, was only 7.9 billion. So do we know what they want from us? What are they interested in? And especially, can we cater to the Chinese demand? One study I read here was that to reach 80% of the upper middle class, you will need to establish yourself in 430 cities. I'm not sure if H&M even have that many stores globally. So Chinese tourism is booming. They're spending a lot of money. Last year, there were 6 million Chinese tourists visiting Europe, but there are problems, especially for visiting Europe, EU. There are visa regulations. My Chinese friends tell me that if you're a wealthy Chinese, you can actually get a 10-year visa, tourist visa to the US or to Australia. And now they're actually discussing this in the UK as well after Brexit, so there will be many more Chinese visiting. Payment. Here you see a picture of WePay. This is the green one. Alipay is the blue one. It's basically you pay with your mobile phone. My Chinese friends, I don't know if it's like that for you as well, Professor Chun. You only carry your mobile phone when you go out. You never use your wallet anymore.
Even you can scan. You go to the metro.
Yeah, you can scan it. You can use it everywhere. If we would have this in Sweden, if we would have Alipay and WePay in Sweden or in Europe, we would probably increase the amount spent by Chinese tourists a lot. Other problems for the Chinese tourists is language and food, but also another challenge is criminality, because they can't use their Union Pay, which is their Visa card. They cannot use their WePay or Alipay, so they're carrying a lot of cash. And that is something that the criminals know. So you told me that there are many people getting robbed in Paris, and they get robbed in Stockholm as well. We've seen since 2011, we've seen like signs saying in Chinese, beware of pickpockets. Not very good. We should do something about that. Anyway, about democracy, and I'm sorry. Well, the Western hopes were that China would democratize when the middle class became big enough. And this is how we allowed China into the World Trade Organization. We hoped that China would follow South Korea and Taiwan, but it has not. And I'm doubtful that if it will, at least not in the close future. Xi Jinping has now managed to make himself, he can stay as long as he wants. He can stay until he dies. There, you see curtailed freedom of speech. It's hard for NGOs to work. You've always talked about NGOs. It's really important for the social system that will build up the democracy web, basically. There is increased surveillance, and they are now creating a social credit system, which means that if you're like a dissident or something, you might not be able to go on high-speed trains. You are not allowed to fly on airplanes. You might not even get a loan at the bank to get a flat. So this is really tough. And also, I think we also need to think about, is democracy the ultimate form of ruling for the Chinese? If we're looking at how democracy is being run in the West at the moment, are we really promoting democracy? They see Trump, they see Brexit, they see all these populist parties coming up. Is this, I don't know. So how well prepared are we to get a piece of the Chinese market? Because China is, after all, a really important market for Europe. And I think that we need to learn a lot more about China to be able to enter the Chinese consumer market and to get these, the seeds that we've sown. And today, what happens? Well, fewer and fewer people are studying Chinese. I even get calls from my Chinese professors in Lund asking, like, there is nobody wanting to study Chinese anymore. Why? And I talked to a company yesterday, and they were supposed to recruit 10 engineers to be sent to China for 2 years. They managed to get 5. Why? Oh, it's like out of fashion, is it? We couldn't find. It's like really. And can we survive without China? I think this is something we need to think about. That was my presentation.
Thank you, Christina. You asked this question rhetorically yourself, but you say that we need to learn more about China, but are we analyzing the demand correctly, or do you see a discrepancy between what the Chinese consumers demand and what Europe has to offer?
I think that it's differences between different European countries. So, for example, we can see that in Germany, there are lots more people studying Chinese. You have a lot more PhD students in Chinese, for example. They have integrated Chinese in like engineers studying and so on, which means that you actually, once you're studying at the university, you're actually being sent out through a German company to work in China, which means that I met someone who used to work, a Swedish guy who worked at a German company, and said, like, when I went to the German Chamber of Commerce, it was crowded with people below 30 years old. They were all fluent in Chinese. You go to the Swedish Chamber of Commerce, it's not really the case. There are even fewer and fewer people who are joining the Swedish Chamber of Commerce because they put Chinese people as CEOs of the Chinese subsidiaries of the Swedish companies, and they don't care about the Swedish Chamber of Commerce. So I think we really need to think about how we can handle, because China is not only an important trade partner, it's also an important global political player.
So lifting this topic that we're discussing to a political level, and I open this question to anyone who wants to answer, how would you describe the trade relations between EU and China today?
You mean economic relations?
Yes.
Yeah, I think we have quite common sense. For example, especially facing with the challenge from Mr. T. Both China and EU are in line with multilateralism. We all support this umbrella with WTO or this kind of international laws. As we all know that both sides are almost the biggest trading partner. And between EU and China, officially, as Chinese always said, we are the partner of growth, reform, as well as civilization. So, yeah, when people are talking about the economic relations, we all know that the bilateral investment treaty was just ongoing for negotiation. As far as I know, there is quite progress, especially in next month, as far as I know. Although I think both sides have complaints for each other. For Chinese side, people always say that we do not have the recognition of full market status. We have some barriers, like nowadays, EU as well as United States setting up this kind of a screening board to investigate the so-called mergers of investment from Chinese sides. From European side, we also have a complaint with market access, protection of IPRs, government procurement. But as we all know that China is insisting on that we should keep openness to the outside world, which follows the speech of President Xi Jinping in Davos, as well as in Europaforum. That's quite clear when we're talking about achievements we have had in the last 4 decades. That's more based on the openness to the outside world. So one of these very concrete evidence I could telling you is the establishment of Chinese pilot FTC, which means free trade zone. Actually, at first, that was established in 2015 in Shanghai, and now it's expanded to almost 13 provinces or cities. The aim for this, according to my personal observation, is that we want to keep on opening to the outside world, and we want to measure the request from outside world, especially from the advanced economy, from United States, from Japan, from EU to us, and the status quo of Chinese side, and to minimize this kind of a gap. Yeah, so one of the significant achievements which Shanghai pilot free trade zone has made is we release a so-called negative list for market access. Which means that besides this negative list, you can invest whatever you want. And this list will be shorter and shorter yearly. So in this sense, I think at first, we all know that we should keep on opening to the outside world and base more on the market-oriented economy. And in a so-called globalized world, you should share with others. Otherwise, you cannot Yeah, people always, by us in China, always say that you go your way, you should also give the way to the other to go. Yeah, so in this sense, I think that both EU and China could have more cooperation. Although I think between these largest economies, no doubt we will have trade frictions or these kind of things. That's normal. Very important is we could not do like Donald Trump has made, yeah? So do not make it unilateralism or make America great again, only, yeah, taking your own interest and do not give way to the others.
Do you want to add to that, Christina?
Well, I think that China is trying to make China great again, isn't
No.
it? So,
No.
I don't know. But I think also that when it comes to China-EU, I think it's a very divided image, because some of the European countries are very dependent on China. For example, Greece. They have had huge investments in the Piraeus harbor, for example, and they've also have lots of loans from China. And so this means that when EU is trying to criticize China for human rights stuff, then Greece is putting in its veto or trying to water out the solutions, the resolutions that come out. And this is a big problem. And when it comes to investment screening, I think it's France, Germany and Italy that is driving it, because they have had so much, they have realized that because of this plan Made in China 2025, which is, I think is actually the real reason why we have a trade war between the US and China at the moment. It's not really about the trade imbalances, it's about China is trying, through this plan, China is trying to become independent of buying like foreign technology. They want to be a technology superpower itself, which means that in the future, if China actually succeeds with this, then we in the EU and the US in the Western world, we might not be as rich as we were. China might be richer, actually. So my joke to my stepchildren that if you don't study hard, you will have to make clothes for the Chinese might actually be true for their grandchildren. We don't know. But this is something that I think is really, really important to think about. And in Germany, there was a study made where they found that of all the acquisitions that China had done in Germany, 64%, this was the period 2014 and 2017, 64% of the acquisitions were actually related to Made in China 2025. This includes the famous robotic company called KUKA, which I think for Swedes is a very stupid name, but at least you will maybe remember it. Since then, Germany has been, this KUKA robotics, they actually could have become a new Siemens, and they were sold to Midea, which is like a whiteware household appliances company similar to Electrolux. And they are now entering the robotic industry sector. And so I think we will see a lot more frictions between China and...
Yeah, I think that's the normal phenomenon when people see the United States in 1940s or 1950s. That's the case. When people see the Japanese and South Korea in 1980s, that's the case. Yeah, so I think like, I agree with one of the points you have mentioned, that the trade war between China and the US is not only due to the interest of make America great again, but also that the policy of containment of United States. So United States want to always the unique superpower and do not want to the people to compete with the number one, I think.
I want to just give the word to Lars, because you also wanted to comment on what was said before.
No, but I was coming back to some of the points that you just raised. I mean, trade relations between, and I think this is very crucial, very important, because time flies so fast. I mean, what you also have said, I mean, things are very different just than 20 years ago, 30 years ago. It's very different. And that also concerns the trade relations between the EU countries and China. I mean, we still have this picture. I think many of us in our minds that the Chinese produce mass production goods, and the more advanced EU countries, or also the US, produce more sort of high knowledge products that sort of and so we compete in a way in different markets.
Yeah.
But what is happening now, and what you have exemplified, what you have shown, is that we are more and more coming to compete about the same markets, and
that's
in the same market. And what your figures show, for example, that, and of course, this kind of machinery category can, of course, contain a lot of different things, but it's very interesting, and this is very typical also that what used to be in the more advanced part of the world. I mean, then we were trading, competing with more advanced products in machinery with each other. And now we do the same with China. So that has changed fundamentally from just 20 years ago. And you just may say that, and of course this also means, and that meant for Europe and the Western world before, this is becoming to be our experience now, is that we're becoming more and more interlinked. Our production chains, our so-called value chains, are becoming more and more interlinked, and this is also leads on to the problem, of course, of the lost sort of the Trump effect, if you want to speak. I mean, this discussion about, or this coming perhaps to more in a situation of trade wars, and that's very. That's dangerous, really, for all of us, I think. So becoming sort of competing in the same markets, becoming sort of both of us, both the EU and China, sort of production of advanced products more and more. That also leads to that we will get some kind of we will also share a lot of problems, and also benefits, but also problems, which connects back to the social welfare, namely, for example, that what we have a common problem now, and you mentioned that about the aging society and aging economy, and of course, in that sense, also financing welfare. We have the same problem in Europe, like you are discussing it. You're coming from a different point, sort of position, and probably not up to the sort of the level of our social expenditure yet, but you're rapidly coming there. So we will share the problems with this financing the welfare sector, and especially the aging society. So we will have a lot of things to discuss. And as I said, being more and more interlinked, we will have these problems of trade wars. If that happens, more kind of protectionism. If it does not lead to trade wars, but at least protectionism, it will be a common problem that we would need to be discussing on all levels, I would say. And
Lars,
the third
I'm
one,
have to stop you there. Because I want to open up for the audience, and I know that Christina wants to add a comment as well. Do we have any questions? Now is the time. Please, up in the back. Microphones are coming.
Yeah, this gentleman.
He was sitting next to you.
Yeah.
Here. Oh, here. Okay.
I have a question to Professor Chung. Is there a dental plan in the medical insurance? And if there isn't, why? And also, I would like to hear, what is your plan for the health insurance? Is it to heal people once they get sick, or do you have preventive measures?
Thank you. We will do this question as well.
Thank you very much. Pardon, the first question is?
medical insurance.
Dental insurance. Yeah.
Dental, yeah.
Does the medical insurance have a dental plan?
Yes, thank you. And we will also take the question down here
To the
so that you can both get answers. Anyone else?
Well, it's just it's really a sort of a comment that if you have any comment on my comment, it might be. But basically, you showed a regression which involves parts of identities, and I'm not very impressed with these sort of aggregate regressions and so on. So I was just wanted to point out to you that in the Reserve Bank of Australia, they did a conference on China 2 years ago. And in that, they used detailed input-output tables from the OECD from exports and imports for China and all other countries. And what they showed, which is exactly the opposite conclusion that you're making, is that actually when you use input-output data in a detailed study, that the summary of it was that the import intensity of investment is actually much higher than the import intensity of consumption for China. So that actually, if you switch more towards a consumption and away from a saving investment society, the trade balance would be likely to go the other way, to deteriorate. And I think that's something that's quite interesting, that because investment is very import intensive for machinery that you were showing from Australia for our minerals and so on and so forth, that actually if you switch to consumption, China's very happy to produce its own consumption goods, and the input-output table show this, so I'm interested in your comment on that.
So maybe Chen Ding wants to...
Yeah. Thank you very much for the two questions. The first question is, when we're talking about our healthcare or medical insurance scheme, that's also include part of this dental treatment, but not, I think, only less than half. But when people are talking about the declaration of teeth or something, that's not included into this. So still to the treatment of the dental treatment by us in China is still very expensive. I think it's also expensive here in Sweden when people are talking about. For the target of healthcare or the medical insurance, I think for the social medical insurance, it's quite clear that we want to provide a unified nationwide medical insurance system for all the citizens, because till now we still have a three-level medical insurance system. That's actually the medical insurance for urban employee, for urban residents, as well as for farmers. So the first step is we combine the medical insurance for urban residents and medical insurance for farmers, merge together for a nationwide national standard scheme for all the citizens, and then jump up to the first level, so that the aim is more standardized criterion for all the citizens by us in China. I hope that I somehow answer your question. And for the professor's question, actually that's we calculate. So actually we have three models. The first two is more evaluate the saving rate and the social expenditure, and also the social expenditure and import. And then finally that's the import to the social expenditure. We have also do some solution for these could be endogenous problems. Yeah, but I actually do not know that what you have made.
So again, if you use detailed input-output tables based on OECD input-output tables for exports and imports from all around the world, including China, you find that actually.
But we do not separate these. I mean, different types according to the CITIC. just
Well, have a look at the study anyway. I think you'll find it quite interesting because when you look at that detail, it shows you quite a different conclusion.
yeah.
Okay, we're running out of time, so I'm going to give the last word to Christina, and then no, sorry, we don't have time. I'm not gonna allow you to have coffee if you keep asking questions. Christina, please.
Okay, I just wanted to say in response to what we were talking about, the trade war. I think that it's important for us to realize that China is becoming a lot more technology advanced than we think in our minds. I mean, China is like world leading within artificial intelligence, for example, and they are coming really strong. But I also think that it's important also for the Chinese side to understand that because also EU has also pledged that there is unfair trade practices from China's side, is that I think that if China would allow market access the same way as we are allowing market access in Europe or in the US, I think there would be no trade war. If China respected intellectual property rights and did not fall into industrial espionage and so on, then I think there would not be a problem, because we have all been fighting with other countries.
I do not think so, because if you take this as a reason why between EU and US have also trade war. So that means you do not give the market access to the United States?
You have a lot of sectors that are actually closed.
Actually, I want to say this, what Jackie Ma has told Donald Trump in Washington. He told Donald Trump that, actually, if you have a look of the export, almost 1/3 of Chinese export are high-tech. Among these, 2/3 are the products of joint ventures. So which means that the owner of this kind of a multinational company, they have the profit. I think the problem is we cannot use the traditional old model of this kind of calculation, only deficit or surplus. More based, like the professor has mentioned, more based on the value added.
Exactly.
That's a supply chain. It's a globalized world. Yeah, so we should throw all this away. Otherwise, we will drop in another big recession like we have in 1929 and 1933. Yeah, so I totally agree with you that it's a globalized world. This kind of economic globalization is free mobility of capital.
Those will be the
not
final...
free mobility of labor force.
Thank you. Those will be the final words. Thank you so much, all of you in the panel, for giving us this complex image of China and EU trade relations and how they're affected by the changing living standards in China. So we will all give you a warm applause. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
You mean Bitcoin? Oh, yeah. We have. Especially rich people, they decrease Yeah, that's more like gambling. You know? You have it. We also have. Yeah. Yeah, I know. Yeah.
Jag? Ja.
Actually, we have also public health thinking. Yeah, because yeah, to be right. So that means if you just repair your tools, it's included in social insurance. But if it's decoration or clean, that's included. Yeah.
Is there a measure of prevention?
Yeah. Because we have always increased input in the public health. Like we have mentioned, not only this, and also some. Yeah, totally right. And people input quite a lot of investment in this fields, even to encourage people to take part in the sports, these kind of things, which is, I think, not only for treatment, but also for rehabilitation, keep healthy. Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
That was what I was asking. I was making my question.
Thank you very much. Yeah, thank you very much.
Very nice meeting you. I'll give you my name first. Hej Joyce.
kabelvägen, stoppar ner innanfickan så får du in kabeln innanför kavajen. Nej, ni får det nu. Vilken ordning tänker ni? Sitta fast, bara in mig i håret. Ja, du kan bara lägga den på håret. Du får in den under håret. Ja, sitta utanför så. De är gjorda för personer utan hår. Kollegan, han klarar det.
So, welcome back to this last session here today after a tough conference week. And first, I would like to express a great thanks to the organizer, Maria Lindblad, and her team, Josephine Smith and Adrian Ekström, for organizing this fantastic conference here in Hässleholm. And we hope there will be a continuation next year, because this is a very important meeting place to change opinions about the EU, and also as a channel of information about the EU. And having said that, we will, in this very last session, discuss the banking union. And that is a very hot topic, not least for the sake that Sweden is not a member of the banking union, but there will be a report in November that should be the document for Swedish politicians to actually take a decision if we should join the banking union or not. And the banking union is for the EU member countries, and then if you are for the Euro countries, and if you are a non-Euro country, you can actually opt to join the banking union. And that is where Sweden is today. And it consists of three pillars, and one is a single supervisory mechanism, and the other one is a single resolution mechanism. And it's said that they are fully implemented in the Euro countries. So for them only remains one part, and is the last one. It is also a common deposit insurance scheme, a European deposit insurance scheme. So, but that has turned out to be very, very tricky. And today we will have a debate here, and we have here a very, very competent panel. You have actually to look for a more competent panel to discuss this question than we have here today, because we had the advisor to the Director General of the OECD. We have the financial advisor to the President of the European Commission, Jean-Claude Juncker. We have the ultimate research expert here from the United States coming in. And also we have the person from the European Parliament that has been heavily involved in this banking union issue. So we really have the best prerequisite for a debate today. And when we start, I think it is about 2 in favor of the banking union and 2 that puts a question mark for the banking union. So maybe there will be a clash today. Let's see. So the first, actually, to give us a background now on the problems that is supposed to be solved by the banking union is Professor Adrian Blundell-Vignal. And he was previously head of financial markets in the OECD, and now he is advisor to the, as I mentioned, to the Director General of OECD. And he has recently published this book here with the title Globalization of Finance at the Crossroads. And he has published a lot also, but I remember him as a person who was the first to actually announce that a financial crisis was imminent when he, early 2007, showed that the subprime loans was packaged in the United States and sold all over the world. So previous to that, everybody thought that this was an American problem, but he showed that we should prepare because a global financial crisis is in the card. So listen carefully now when we will get the problem here from Adrian. The floor is yours, Adrian.
Well, thanks, Lars. I must say I really enjoy it when Lars introduces me because I love it when Lars introduces me because, you know, he's like, you can't say those things for yourself. And after because I retired as director last November, and that incident and the reason why the SG, the Secretary General, likes me so much is because he remembers all that, and so he's kept me on as his advisor. So anyway. So but what Lars asked me to do today was to talk about to try to put it in a more general context of the economic situation in Europe, and with an emphasis on, you know, the banking union is supposed to help solve, and conclude on my views as to whether the banking union is some sort of a solution to that. I should just say before I get into this that, you know, just to be a little bit clear, is that I don't want to say that I've got no objection to the idea of a banking union. I think that's a great idea. So the question is the relative importance of the banking union as a solution to anything in Europe is sort of things that I'll be touching on today. Well, I guess the first thing to note is that in terms of Europe, you'll see here pictures of the shares of the world economy of Europe. You can see there in the blue bars, and you can see what's been happening. You know, the share of Europe in the world economy has basically halved. And if you look at the Belt and Road countries, China in the grey and the Belt and Road excluding China in the blue, you'll see that that's been rising to something like 50% of the world economy. So the main country making room for that huge expansion is Europe. I mean, everybody's making a little bit of room, but Europe's making the biggest contribution to opening up shares for other countries. So there seems to be Europe doing less well than others. My view is that the Commission has always been a little bit misleading. You know, I've got a quote here from 1998, before the euro came in, where they said that all these problems of asymmetric shocks and things things, they wouldn't, they'd sort of go away, and this was going to be a way to get convergence. I think that's not, that was never true, and that the huge asymmetric shock that's affecting the world economy today, I think, is the background of the context of the context. But because when China and the Belt and Road countries come in, this is the biggest asymmetric shock you could ever imagine for Europe, because the north of Europe, and I think we might have seen a bit of that in the previous session, the north of Europe is sort of vertically integrated into the Belt and Road countries by high technology goods. My country, Australia, is vertically integrated through resources and things like that. But the south of Europe is competing with China and the Belt and Road countries. So in that situation, economic theory tells you the south should devalue against the north, but they can't, so they have an internal devaluation, which is really killing them. And so here I've got a picture where you just starting from when the euro started, of the cumulative the GDP, through that period. And so I've taken the non-euro countries, which are in the blue, the North Euro countries in the grey, and the South Euro countries in the black. I don't think I need to say any more that the euro is a big problem, and it's particularly a big problem for the South that can't devalue against the North. And this, to me, is easily the biggest problem that we have to deal with. Now, when you think about the QE and so on, because I bring it towards banking now, you see there that all these countries, because of the crisis, have had huge buying of securities. In the United States, mortgage-backed securities, government bonds and so on, the same thing in Europe. And you can see that Europe is, as the US begins to now talk about getting rid of this, I think Europe is also talking about stopping. But this $5.5 trillion or so of QE for the euro version of QE and the negative interest rates, you have to ask why? When we know that low interest rates and negative interest rates are extremely bad for deposit banks, that hurts them. So why do we have these policies? And I think when you sort of reduce down to it, I'm not going to go through this in great detail because Lars asked me to stick to 20 minutes for this really big topic. But basically, I think, to me, I just think that part of the reason is to keep the euro as weak as you can, but also because the European banking system is not yet ready to reabsorb all the assets that have been bought by the ECB, and I think that if you look at the United States, who is now ready, I think the reason why the United States is ready is, if you look at this bottom sort of comment here, is because there are a number of steps you have to take in dealing with the crisis, and more or less in order: inject liquidity, insure deposits, deal with the bad assets, which the US done through a mechanism which I call the Fannie and Freddie bad bank, and recapitalise the banks and separate off the risky business segments. Now that's sort of, the US has more or less done all elements of that to greater or lesser extent. And of course, the United States now is in a position where the banks are in quite a strong position. They're supporting the recovery, and what Europe hasn't done is followed all those steps. They did not, in particular, deal with the bad assets, didn't find a way to deal with the bad assets. So what you see here is what I think is I don't know, to me it's quite shocking. You see here the NPLs. We've broken this up at the OECD between these are not GSIBs, these are in general, very large banks and other smaller banks. So where 50 billion is the cutoff. And so what you see here is that while most countries have had the NPLs falling since the crisis, are dealing with them, you see this is just not the case in Europe, and there's very, very big NPL problems. Do I need to stick there? So, well, that just describes what I've just said. And I'll skip this one because it's a little bit technical, but this was at the peak of the euro crisis, showing you the distance to default of various banks, 67 banks there, US on the left and Europe on the right. And if you look at that number 41 onwards, some of those banks were in deep, deep trouble. And of course, those issues, to my view, haven't really been dealt with. So, now, I said the banking union, I think, is it's a great idea. You know, like I have no problem with that whatsoever. It's got some clear aims, and there are some clear advantages, synergies and scale economies. You know, like each country might have 1 or 2 GSIBs, but they're all interrelated with each other. So if you get together, then you have economies of scale in thinking about these issues. Obviously, resolution mechanisms, deposit insurance, all these things are really important, and they can do things like reduce regulatory arbitrage. They can reduce this possibility of national liquidity silos. You get consistency and harmony of supervision. I think all those are laudable, and I don't have any objection to that. But you have to understand that if you're just a national country like America or Australia, that goes without saying, you already have a banking union. It's just like there. So this is like catch-up time for Europe, trying to put together something where you're not a country, you don't have fiscal union, you don't have a fiscal backup to everything, and you're trying to find a way to deal with this for the European situation, which is trying to also deal with the problems of growth and so on that I spoke about earlier. So no problem with the banking union. I think it's a good step. And I just summarise. I think Lars has mentioned some of the points here. I won't go into them in any detail, just to keep to strictly to my 20 minutes. But you can see there the single resolution mechanism, deposit insurance, and the single supervisory mechanisms. These are all very important. And the thing I'll just talk a little bit about is this MREL thing. I think this is where, in terms of dealing with a resolution, if you don't have a fiscal union to back things up and you don't have a big deposit insurance fund, then you have to have this bail-in mechanism. And so this is what the banking union is mainly about, to be able to bail in bondholders. And the question is that going to be a way to deal with crises, to deal with these NPL problems and so on? I think so this just summarises what I said there. Again, I don't have any problem with it, but I keep repeating that it's something that any country that's not EU, not a euro area country, they already have that. So it's not like we didn't have crises and things in other parts of the world that have essentially automatically have a banking union. So, you know, it's a good first step, but the question is, will it actually work? And this is, so you can see here just some of the summary points of what it is at the moment. You know, the single resolution fund is actually still very small. It has a very long period to reach its 1%. The United States is at 1.3% already, and is already much bigger. And then to have access to this single resolution fund, you have to, if something happens, you have to bail in quite a lot of liabilities. And of course, in my view, and I'm sure I'll get disagreement about this, in my view, this is a way to, I think basically, countries don't want to be responsible for anyone else's bank. So if you can put it on to the creditors, then you can sort of avoid having any big contingent liabilities for the fiscal authorities of the country. So the question is, will that work? Well, I think, again, I just summarised some of the points that I pick up in my reading about it all, and I'm happy to be corrected on any of it. But basically, there's, at the moment, MREL is having the sufficient of these bonds that can be bailed in that makes sense. So, you know, is it going to be big enough? And that's what MREL is about, to try to make it such that all banks have to have enough bail-in securities. But at the moment, it's done on a bank-by-bank basis. There's no general subordination requirement. The FSB survey shows that, well, actually the EBA itself in a 2016 study showed that there could be a shortfall, depending on what the criteria actually turn out to be, of 130 billion to 280 billion, which is quite a big shortfall. And the FSB says that a lot of members in the world in general, but including Europe, don't have the right to you know, the legal administrative powers to impose losses on creditors or to convert bonds into equity. And finally, there's a no credit or worse off criteria, which I think is quite important, because one of the big problems when you have bail-in is that you can have what's called uncompensated risk, transferring of risk. So, if it comes down to depositors, for example, if you have to, like Europe tried to do with respect to Cyprus at one point, if you have depositors and you use or try to bail in depositors because you don't have enough securities that have the right degree of subordination and so on, then of course you would have uncompensated risk transfer. So people would then not be compensated for the fact that because there isn't enough subordinated bonds, and it comes down to dealing with the bank or a number of banks that where deposits became at risk, and the deposit fund wasn't big enough to deal with it, etc., that you would have this uncompensated risk transfer. So I think these are some of the issues that are potential flaws that have to be fixed. I think I've made these points just now. Now the question I have is, I think we don't have enough deposit. We don't have enough deposit insurance at the moment. The MREL thing is in early stages. So if something happens now, this is where the question of, well, what happens? Do governments have to pay? Does German taxes have to pay for someone else's bank? Well, no, that's what this is sort of designed to avoid. So I think the question is, does this matter for European banks? And I think I use the word that European banks are uninvestable. And I say that because the head of UBS, the CEO of UBS, he basically used that phrase, that European banks are uninvestable. And I want to talk about that very briefly. So, and this is the only slightly technical part that I will talk about, is that you have the what's called the firm-specific equity risk premium. So basically, in equilibrium, the yield you get on equity, the dividend yield plus the expected growth in earnings of that fund should be higher than in equilibrium than the risk-free rate, the government bond rate, and the difference between the two is the risk premium. And the relationship of an individual stock to the equity risk premium for the whole market is measured by this thing called beta, which is the covariance of the firm's stock price with respect to the national stock market. So beta greater than 1 for a bank tells the analyst that risk factors driving markets will have a larger effect on banks than they will on other sectors, and vice versa. So any tendency for beta to rise suggests that compared to the overall equity risk premium, investors would need higher returns to invest in a bank given the equilibrium relationship with a risk-free investment. So what does it look like? This is based on detailed bank data looking at calculating this beta. And you'll see Europe, Switzerland, United Kingdom, Japan, China, and the United States. This is based on individual bank data. And you'll see there that the beta in the case of Europe is up there around 1.7. It's extremely high, way above 1. The United States is around 1.5. And some of the Japan, China banks, because they're not well, Chinese banks are mainly state-owned banks, so they don't have this very high beta. And when you use these betas to calculate the average bank cost of equity in the regions, you'll see that the cost of equity for European banks is extremely high. And if you come down, you'll see the United States much lower, and Japan, China lower even still. And just to show you the composition of that for the United States and Europe, you'll see there that the grey is hiding the blue. And you'll see there that that's the overall equity risk premium for the US stock market, and the blue, which is hidden a bit by the grey, which is the risk premium, the difference between the cost of equity and the government bond rate. So you'll see there in Europe the risk premium for the overall market is around 9.5, something like that. In the United States, it's lower. But when you use the beta that I showed you before to calculate the cost of equity for a European bank, you see there that it's up around 16, whereas in the case of the United States, because of the way they handled the crisis, is actually much lower. Now, sorry, just to come back to that. So when when you have when a bank is investable, what that means is that the bank can earn a rate of return on equity which is equal to or better than the cost of equity. And you can see here that in the United States, that they would have to, earning something like above 8% is something that's doable. Banks can earn above 8% in their ROE. But if you look at the European banks, earning above 16 is just not doable. So this is what the CEO of UBS is talking about when he says that European banks are not investable. So when you think about long-term investing, and banks are not investable, it means that they have huge problems raising equity. So if you wanted to do this right, what you should be doing is those 5 steps. Deal with the NPLs. This is after the liquidity phase. Deal with the NPLs and raise sufficient equity. Then you don't need this, this big MREL bail-in, all this kind of stuff to deal with the problem, because the banks are basically well capitalised. But you can't raise equity when you haven't dealt with the NPLs and you haven't dealt with some of the other reform processes that haven't been done in Europe. So if we look at the question and say, well, since the banking union came into effect at the end of 2014, has there been any discernible improvement in the situation for European banks? And here I just show the credit default swaps for subordinated bonds, the sort of thing that you use in a banking union. These are subordinated bonds for the various banks that are shown up there. These are very, obviously the large GSIB banks. So this black dotted line is just taking 4 US GSIBs and saying, okay, there's the CDS spread, the credit default swap spread so what you have to pay to insure subordinated bonds in the United States. And there you can see a number of European banks, but typically German banks, Deutsche Bank and Commerzbank, but also some of the Italian banks, not so much the French banks. And you see there that people said that one of the reasons to have the banking union is that these blue bars here, which is an average debt-weighted average of the CDS spread for government bonds, that was what, during this period of the Euro crisis of 2011-12 around here, that the spillover of the budget problems, because banks had interrelated cross-border effects of the holdings of government bonds, this was a major part of the problem. But what you see over here is that at the moment, at least, this has not been the problem in Europe, but the banking problem is still there. So you see now, this is the bank situation is doing this itself. It's not a question of spillovers of the sovereign anymore. This is a problem of the banks. And I think Lars is standing there, so I'll stop. But I think again, the banking union's fine. I think. But we really do need to have a leverage ratio, GSIB separation, and I forgot to put in here the most important thing, which is, because I was doing this in Africa while I was on holidays, the most important thing to do is to have dealing with these NPL problems. Because if you do all those things, you make the proper reform, you get the leverage ratio up high enough, and you have deal with the bad loan problems, then you have the beta goes down, the cost of equity goes down, banks can recapitalise, and you don't have to rely on these things that are potentially problematic. Would you like me to stop, sir?
Okay, thank you very much. Okay. So please, you can move over there. So next I will save my question because we have to stop 4:30 sharp. So the next speaker is Paulina Demjek-Hack, and she is currently the financial advisor to the President of the European Commission, and she has a background in the European Commission since 2004, and I've worked in many positions, also very close to Michel Barnier that we heard about earlier today, and she holds a PhD from University of Heidelberg. The floor is yours, Paulina.
Thank you very much, Lars, and Thank you very much, Lars, and good afternoon to everyone. Very happy to be here in Hässleholm. I'm also looking forward to the debate later, because I think I will approach the issues from a rather fundamentally different perspective than the previous speaker. Now, if we start with the euro itself, it's a young currency. It's only been around for 20 years, but it's the currency that's being used in 19 member states. 430 million people use it every day. 60 further countries and territories are directly or indirectly pegged to the euro. It's the world's second largest reserve currency. And rather interestingly, the approval of the euro in the countries in the euro area and the countries using the euro is at a record high 74% for the moment. And I think that rather than pointing to weakness of the euro, we should say that it's rather remarkable that a currency which is so young and which is not linked to a unitary state, which is obviously a very big difference to the dollar, the yen and other currencies, is actually doing very, very well in a complicated global context. We have a common institution for the euro, which is the European Central Bank. It's independent in setting its, of course, pursuing its monetary policy in the same way as national central banks. It has a very clear mandate, and it was suggested before that the European Central Bank would be trying artificially to keep low the rate of the euro. I think that is not correct. The European Central Bank has one policy target, and that's inflation. It does not have a mandate to have a target when it comes to the exchange rate of the euro or its value in the market. If we then look more generally on the kind of economic situation in Europe, we are now at the 21st consecutive quarter of growth. Growth for 2018 and forecast 2019 will be somewhere around 2%. We have the lowest unemployment in a decade, with 12 million new jobs created since 2014. A public deficit which was 6.6% in 2009 is now down to 0.8%. Public debt still high, 88% 2014, now hovering around 81%. We're also doing a lot when it comes to investment. Following the crisis, there was a clear investment gap in most of European countries. Government had cut spending and public spending on infrastructure in particular. Thanks to the investment plan for Europe, we have now mobilized 335 billion additional investment throughout the European Union, including in Sweden, by the way. Comparing to the United States, and I think one should always be a little bit careful with these comparisons because it's never entirely comparable. The EU is not a federal state. We are 28 still member states coming together. The US is a unitary state. But if we look at public debt and public deficit, we have a deficit in the United States which is 5.3% compared to 0.8% in Europe, and a debt which is at 108%. Now, if we look at the financial sector, and I'm coming to banking union in a second, we will in a couple of weeks' time be at the, if you wish, symbolic 10 years anniversary of the bankruptcy or declaration of bankruptcy of the American investment bank Lehman Brothers. As you all know, that triggered a global financial crisis. It didn't start in Europe, but it certainly had a lot of consequences in Europe. And I think if we look back at where we were in 2009, 2010, 2011, we have come a very long way. If we first look at Europe's bank, they now have a capital ratio on average of 19%. They have added 782 billion in liquid assets since 2014. The banks are building up, and the previous speaker referred to that, bail-inable capital, meaning capital that when a bank gets into difficulties, that capital will be used before depositors would be touched, and of course before we would retort to state money. This is a process, ongoing process, already been mentioned, but the banks are relatively advanced in putting in place these so-called bail-inable buffers. Non-performing loans have been mentioned, indeed a challenge, a remaining challenge certainly in some parts of Europe, particularly in Southern Europe. At the same time, I think we have very different figures, because my figures, which are figures from the European Central Bank and the European Banking Authority, points to a decrease by a third since 2014, and according to the very latest figures, the ratio for NPLs in the euro area are around 4.5%. And to just mention one example, Italy, a country often referred to as having done very little in terms of sanitizing its banking sector, the reduction year on year when it comes to non-performing loans is 25%. Now, on the regulatory side, of course, a lot has happened as well. We have the reason that the banks are in a much better shape today than they were 10 or 8 or 6 years ago. It's because the regulation has become much more stringent, higher capital requirements, and importantly, also much more intrusive supervision, and new structures have been put into place. That is, on the one hand, on the macroeconomic side, the so-called European Stability Mechanism, which is a permanent crisis fund that can be used to support euro area member states in trouble. The one case you're all very aware of is, of course, Greece, which had to get a couple of support packages from the other euro area member states, but which now also, as you may know, for a couple of weeks, or more or less 1 week ago, actually exited its support program and will now be able to, so to say, continue without this support from other euro area member states. We have also put in place banking union, which has been, as has been mentioned, contained 3 different elements. One is the centralized supervision of systemic euro area banks in Frankfurt under the European Central Bank. We then have the Single Resolution Agency, which has also been referred to, based in Brussels. Now, this is very important, because what happened during the crisis was that some supervisors and some national resolution authorities were a little bit too cozy with the national banking market. So instead of taking action quickly when things started to go bad, they were actually waiting, and they thought, okay, maybe this can be sorted in some other way. So the idea of having, and it's really the core idea of the banking union, to have independent institutions that are, of course, working together with national supervisory authorities and national resolution authorities, but which have their own competencies and are centralized European institutions and agencies, is a very important element here. We also see that this actually works. The European Central Bank has been the supervisor of Europe's systemic banks since 2014, and the Single Resolution Agency, has been referred to, has had a couple of practical cases where we see that bank resolution actually works. Banks can exit the market without the financial stability problems that we had in the past. Maybe one word on bail-in. From our perspective, from the European regulators' perspective, the important thing with bail-in is to protect taxpayers' money. Because indeed, yes, what you can do when a bank gets into trouble, you can put in a lot of state resources. That happened during the crisis, and we think it makes sense that should not happen in the future, which is the reason why those that invest in banks should pay the price before the taxpayer is called on again. Very briefly, because I understand that I am coming to the end of my speaking time. All this said, of course, does not mean that everything is good and well. We are in a globally changing and complex world. There are vulnerabilities around us, geopolitical tensions in emerging markets and everything else. So we believe very strongly that we need to take the last steps to finalize the banking union. Part of that would be a European Common Deposit Insurance Scheme, and there I agree with the first speaker that this would be an important additional safeguard for European depositors. We need to work on capital markets union, extremely important. If we want to have a well-functioning a well-functioning financial market, we also need capital markets that can absorb and share some of the risks in the system. So all that to say that, and I should add that some progress is being made. The President of the European Council, Mr. Donald Tusk, has included the economic monetary union work and the banking union work as part of his so-called leaders' agenda, meaning that the leaders, the heads of state and government, have been discussing these issues in March this year, in June this year, and are now working towards December to be able to take concrete decisions in this area. It's true that things sometimes take time in Europe, that they're not so fast as one would possibly want. At the same time, there is a democratic process where we have the European Parliament, and the speaker after me will also give that perspective, and member states that need to agree. It is normal in Europe that things happen through evolution rather than revolution, but I would feel very strongly that when we look at the banking union, when we look at where we are on the economic and monetary union, and the euro, that the glass is clearly half full. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paulina Deimek-Hack. And our next speaker is Gunnar Hökmark. Please come up. And Gunnar Hökmark joined the Swedish Parliament 1982 up to 2004, and then from 2004 onwards he has been a very active member of the European Parliament, where he also has been the deputy chairman of the EPP party. So the floor is yours, Gunnar.
Thank you very much. A lot of figures and a lot of perspectives. I think I will be very short. First of all, I think we're discussing very different things. The banking union is not supposed to solve the problems of European economy. The European economy is of another kind. The European economy is much better than some people tend to say, and sometimes a little bit worse. If we look upon the Baltic Sea area, for example, you have one of the most competitive economies in the world. And some of them with the euro, and some, for example, Sweden, not with the euro. And if you look upon the fundamental problems of European economy, it is mainly the fact that a lot of member states, a lot of nations have not reformed their economies. That is the main problem for Italy, who hasn't had a real growth per capita the last 3 decades. Meaning that they have not been able to adapt to the competition in the global economy, and that creates problem. But that has nothing to do with the euro as such. I would even say if Greece or Spain or Portugal or Italy hadn't had the euro, they would have developed downwards all the time. Because then there had been no pressure at all for the reforms they are now still implementing. That goes very much for Portugal and Spain, who did a rather good job during the crisis. That is very true for the Baltic states, who entered the euro by dealing with that. If you take a global look on macroeconomy, meaning how stable and well-performing economies are, in some way, and I think that's, I would like to add that to the figures. I don't have any figure here, so I'm just showing with my hands. The big source of instability in the global economy as we see today is, from one kind, well-performing, but from another kind, a loose cannon. That's the American economy, the US economy.
The booming economy.
Well, that's one way. You know, Sweden is, some people say, booming. But our currency has fallen 10%. And we have a rather low growth per capita. And the US economy is the one who feels so threatened about global competition that is waging a trade war. It's booming because all of us, Europe and US, have had extreme monetary policies, and which I'm going to add, and I think that must be mentioned. US have had a huge deficit for so long time. So if you compare the depth of the US economy with the European economies, the dollar wouldn't be allowed to be in the Eurozone. it is coming close to 100%. Is it today over 77? I say 77 because 77 is normally said to be some sort of tipping point. It's a huge problem. And what we saw in the financial crisis with Freddie Mae and Fannie Mac and Lehman Brothers, it was how a perverse deficit policy created financial problems. Banking union, on the other hand, is meant to be there in order to stabilize banking sector. It is doing quite well. It's not solving problems, but it's trying to contain them and provide a basis for them. And the BRD, the Banking Resolution Directive, well, it does say that it's. I was responsible for this legislation in the European Parliament, and I told my socialist and communist friends, this is the way of relaunching capitalism in the banking sector, meaning that owners and investors are to pay the risk. And that means that you do the bail-in, and we have the resolution plans and the hierarchy, etc. So it is not that huge problem. But we also create the market discipline. So everyone who is investing in a bank or owning a bank knows that he or she will face the problems when the problems are coming. That has created a disciplinary effect, which we didn't see. And in Europe, this is so important because the banking sector is dominating the financial economy, while in US, the banking economy is only a slight part of it, while you have all the other institutions like Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, but also a capital market, which is much more developed than in Europe, but on the other hand, faced with the huge risks of the US deficit. I'm stopping there.
So, the next speaker is Professor Claes Wilborg from Chapman University. And he has been a professor of banking in Sweden. Actually, I think it was the first professor of banking we had in Sweden. And also he was professor in Denmark in banking, and there he launched the Law and Economics Institute before he moved to the United States. So the floor is yours, Claes.
Do I have my thing? Yes.
5 minutes.
Okay, thank you. Well, I have very much enjoyed the talks from the previous speakers, even though there is some kind of disagreement. I will probably I'm probably more on the line of the first speaker, as you will see, and I'm a little bit of a skeptical about the progress of the banking union in certain respects. And the particular topic that I will focus on is what's called the too big to fail problem. And much of the problem, or much of the work after the financial crisis on regulation and regulatory reform in the financial sector has been aimed at coming to grips with the too big to fail problem. That is to say, banks are so big that governments, authorities cannot just close them down, let them fail, and have different types of creditors of the banks losing money. One can accept shareholders losing, but not so much more. Now, the reason why the too big to fail problem is a very relevant one and worth considering is one that was, of course, after the financial crisis, everyone said taxpayers should not have to spend a lot of money to bail out banks. And the reason is partly that the so-called bailouts, the saving banks, which was done to a very large extent during the crisis, it creates an implicit subsidization of the very large and complex banks that are considered too big to fail. Because the people who lend money to those big banks, they need not fear of losing money. And therefore, the costs of funding for those very large and complex banks becomes lower than the cost for smaller and medium-sized banks that might be allowed to fail, because when they fail, they don't have such big systemic consequences. So this implicit subsidization, in turn, also creates excessive risk-taking. That is to say, the banks become too risky, and therefore the financial system becomes more prone to crisis. So if we cannot come to grips with the too big to fail problem, most likely the excessive risk-taking in the banking sector will continue in different ways, although there are other ways they come to grips with it, but it's still there, and the concentration will increase further and in the financial system. So the reforms that we've been working on, there's a number of different things, but what has been discussed here specifically are the so-called bail-in rules. That is to say, resolution procedures for allowing banks to close without creating systemic consequences. And in the European Banking Union, Monetary Union, they have the so-called single resolution mechanism. But more or less the same rules apply in the European Union outside the euro area as well, because all European Union countries are under the Bank Recovery and Resolution Directive, and which essentially includes elements that are very similar to the single resolution mechanism in the European Monetary Union. So these procedures is first that, well, the supervisory authority should correct problems as soon as they see them. But then if a bank really is in trouble and fails and doesn't have any more equity capital, well, then in the resolution procedures, a bridge bank should be created to continue critical functions. And the so-called bail-ins come into effect. That is to say, creditors, people who have lent to the bank that are not insured by deposit insurance, they would have to take losses, especially the bondholders in the bank. They must take the losses, and those losses should come up to 8% of total liabilities before any aid to the bank can be given. Then the so-called resolution fund comes in, and the thing is supposed to be strengthened by having European rules for state aid. That is to say, state aid to a bank should not be allowed unless these 8% losses for bondholders in the banks have been satisfied. Now, they're pressing the wrong button. So what happens? What is the reality of this? I call it exceptions and experiences. Well, in the rules, there are exceptions for so-called systemic risk. That is, if the bank's closing should create such big problems that the system is under threat. Well, then we make an exception. There can be recapitalization in different ways. It's supposed to be without state aid, but that's also not always enforced. So there have been a lot of experience with banks failing, or some experience with banks failing, and the experiences are so far fairly mixed. In Portugal, the bail-in procedures essentially were not applied very strictly. In Monte dei Paschi di Siena recapitalization in Italy, the bail-in procedures were not implemented very strongly, very small losses for the bondholders, because in both Portugal and Italy, bondholders are essentially households to a large extent, hold the bank bonds. And the politicians don't like the households to lose too much money. Was considered the more successful bail-in was the Banco Popular in Spain, where losses were imposed on the junior. But what conclusions can we draw? What if a really big bank fails? In Sweden, SE Bank or Handelsbanken. would the Swedish resolution authorities let them fail? If Danske Bank in Denmark is on the verge of collapse, would they let them fail? Most likely, no. The systemic risk exception will come in. And that is to say, for the big banks, the rules for bail-ins, etc., resolution procedures, are not credible. People don't believe them. Financial markets don't believe them. Well, how can we see that? Well, there has been a number of studies, a few studies now, of what is the effect of the bail-in rules on the cost of funding in the bond markets for banks. And there are a number of studies that show, well, on the average, the bail-in rules has led to an increase in the return on these bonds, on bank bonds, which is evidence that there is some credibility of bail-ins. But as soon as they distinguish between the big banks and the small banks, you find no effect on the big banks. In other words, the result of the whole thing is that big banks have got an even larger advantage relative to the small and medium-sized banks than before. In other words, we are encouraging even more concentration of the banking industry than before, and getting bigger and bigger banks. Unless, of course, we see a really big bank crash and they apply these losses. But it's not likely that we will ever see that. Okay. So the problem remains and is getting worse.
Okay, thank you very much, Klaus.
Thank you.
So, unfortunately, we started 10 minutes late, so, but now we will have some responses here from the different panelists here. First out is Paulina, yeah? You wanted to comment.
I'm happy to go first, though. No, just maybe a couple of points. In response to the last intervention, I don't think it's right, to be honest. I have a different opinion. I think what you said in terms of a implicit privilege, notably for bigger banks, and the too big to fail problem, it was clearly there. 10 years ago, it was clearly that during the financial crisis. It was also the reason why many member states had to put a lot of tax money into the banks, because the counterfactual would have been a meltdown of the financial system, which would then have pulled the real economy down with it. But the examples you mentioned are all right, the recent examples from Monte dei Paschi, Novo Banco, and Banco Popular. But Monte dei Paschi and Banco Popular are not small banks. They are big banks, and the rules were followed in both cases. There were not small losses imposed on bondholders in Monte Paschi. I think it was 5 billion. I need to check the figures. And I think our new rules are intelligent in the sense that they actually foresee different possibilities. There is a possibility under certain circumstances to recapitalize a bank. That possibility was used for Monte Paschi. For Banco Popular, it was a classical resolution, which means that bondholders were wiped out. These people had to pay. There was not a single cent of taxpayers' money spent in the case of Banco Popular. So, of course, you can say to some extent that the jury is still out, because we have not had in Europe since the crisis, fortunately, a problem in one of the very biggest banks. But I would tend to say that the situation is fundamentally different today than it was 5 or 6 or 7 or 8 years ago.
Thank you very much. Considering that we are short of time, I think that we should actually summarize, in a sense, the takeaway from this panel here, considering what you have said, all of you. So if we start with Adrian here. So is the banking union a good idea, or how should it be changed to work?
Well, as I said, I don't have any problem with the progressing with the banking union. I think the key point that I'd make, if I had to pick one thing, was that banks have to be properly capitalised. And if they're not, and if banks are not investable, so you can't raise money, which is the case in Europe, then you have to have things like bail-in. Now, the problem with bail-in is that you have to have truly subordinated bonds, and secondly, you have to have clear triggers. But let me tell you, I spent 15 years of my life managing money. If you put that clearly, what the triggers are, and clearly put it into the contracts of the bonds, then straight away when you see a bail-in point arriving, you'll induce a crisis. And you saw that with when people thought that Deutsche Bank might be bailed in. You saw an immediate jump in the CDS spread. It went from 100 to 300 almost overnight. So we've had this little test of, oh my goodness, if you're going to have a bail-in, bang, up go the cost of insurance. So can I have another comment or not?
Let's see if we have time. We go to Paulina again. So what is the takeaway?
Well, I mean, happy to let other speakers come in first, because I've already speaking twice.
You respond. Yeah, go to Gunnar.
Well, it's up to everyone for him or her to take his takeaway. But I would like to say 3 points, very short. First of all, the 8% rule, and I know because I forced that into the legislation. Commission had the proposal that there should be no restriction. And I forced it in of 2 reasons. One, because you always will enter macroeconomic situations where you need some sort of public intervention in order to stabilize the banking system. That's a very strong experience from how this was dealt with in Sweden in the 90s, in UK recently, and in United States. But it was also there in order to create the credibility. And I can assure you, on the markets, is a full understanding that this is legislation, and this is a legislation that they have to follow. That you need to bail in 8%, meaning either convert it to share capital or write it down, or if you do the bridge banking, a lot of other things. Be sure about that. I meet all these banks, and they are so aware of these things. That's why when we are now changing, I mean, this is old stuff in reality, because we are now developing the legislation with the subordinated debt and TLAC and the hierarchy, which is clarifying in what order you are going to do things. But the main important thing is, are European banks well capitalized or not? Well, I would say they are, but also they can be better, of course. We don't solve it by a leverage ratio. That's, so to say, that is not taking into consideration the fact that banks are very different. For example, Northern European banks are dealing a lot with housing. That would force out all the housing financing and make them less secure. But are they well supervised? Well, much better. Is the banking union good or not? Well, I think the banking union is a logical consequence if you have a currency. You need to have some common institutions like the supervisory structure, like the resolution structure. But we have also, and Sweden is much more into the banking union than we tend to believe, because we have the same platform, the same legislation. So for me, this is not a dramatic thing. And the euro is not that dramatic thing. I think you can look upon the euro or the currency as a fever thermometer. If things are going well, then it's strong. Or if it's going bad, it is going worse. But the main thing is you need to have competitive economies.
No one has mentioned actually the timing. Is it the right timing to increase legislation or regulations in the EU while we had deregulation in the United States that changed the competitiveness in terms of higher transaction costs?
I'm not a friend of much regulation, and therefore I have acted in that direction. But mind you that one of the problems with the crisis came from too little regulation in US banks. And the fact that they are deregulating now is not a good project.
No, it was just a general question. I mean, if it's the timing is right now. Klaus.
Well, I would say that final thought here, that we cannot develop an effective or efficient financial system under the current situation. We have to essentially reduce the weight of banks. Banks are more and more, and have for a long time become more and more like what we call public utilities. And the really big ones, concentration has increased. The really big banks will never be allowed to fail. There are enough exceptions in the rules that with bail-in, etc., they will not fail. And that means that they are still subsidized in a way relative to other sectors of the financial sector. But we don't, how much do we really need banks? I think we need to think about, maybe we don't need banks as much as we do. Maybe we should encourage in different ways the other sectors of the part of the financial sector and reduce the weight of banks in the system.
Okay, thank you. And the final word to Paulina.
Thank you. And maybe 3 very brief points from me as well. On deregulation in the United States, I'm very much with Gunnar on this one. I think I'm also not a friend of over-regulation. I think, however, the financial crisis showed very clearly that there was too little regulation, definitely in the US to some extent also in Europe. It's a good thing that we have reinforced the rules. And by the way, we are still also tweaking some elements of the banking rules. I don't think deregulation is the way to go. A second point, which goes a little bit in direction of the previous speaker, but I think from another perspective, I think, yes, developing capital markets is a very good and a very necessary thing in the European Union, not to replace banks, but to have this additional element of risk sharing, which we do not have today in an economy which is very, very, very dependent on banks. And the third word on banking union and possible prospects of Sweden joining. Of course, from a Commission perspective, we think it's very positive that the current government has decided to look into this issue and understand that that the results of this report will come at some point next year. It's clear that for an international banking sector, like in all the Nordic and Scandinavian countries, it could make sense to be part of the banking union and have the centralized supervision from the European Central Bank. As you're all aware, of course, Nordea, for example, decided to move from Sweden to Finland recently. But I will stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Professor Vignal, Blundell Vignal, has a train to catch in 7 minutes, so we have to stop here. Help me to thank our eminent panel. Yeah, we need to go.
I'm sorry, I have the question.